when it's going to be possible for trans people to register at a sexual health clinic in England and pick an option that actually reflects who they are, rather than male, female, or other.
Is that still not happening?
Alright.
Hey peeps, what's up? This is Aedan and welcome to episode 8 of How to Stay Positive When You Test Positive, the Diaries. Today I have with me Aedan J. Wolton, trans health advisor. Thanks for joining me.
You're welcome.
How are you doing?
Yeah, really good.
I'm really glad to have you on my channel. I have so many questions for you. You diagnose people with HIV, right?
Yeah, I work with anybody that comes into the clinic that happens to test positive, but I guess my special area of interest and the work that I enjoy doing most is working with trans communities.
It must be quite difficult, right? To tell someone the news.
I kind of feel like I'm in quite a lucky position to be able to work with somebody in an area that is so sensitive and so raw and so intimate, and try and make it maybe a little bit less shit for them. I think that's it's a really lucky thing that I can
Especially
do.
bridging the two, right? Delivering the news that someone's HIV positive is an art. You can easily get it wrong. Could you demonstrate how you would deliver the news that someone's positive?
I try not to be vague. So I think sometimes when people don't necessarily explain in a really solid way what the test result means, there's always that part of somebody that thinks something here has gone hideously wrong and I'm still HIV negative. I think to be really solid and really clear but sensitive at the same time, like I said, it definitely is an art. I don't think we always do it perfectly because humans aren't perfect.
Sure.
I guess the other thing is that even if you do it perfectly, you're still delivering news to somebody that they don't want to hear. So even if you do everything right to all the boxes and you're empathetic and you're sympathetic and you're really clear, you're still delivering news that
People just don't know. Okay, what kind of vocabulary you don't think anyone needs to hear?
I'm really sorry, but this is a positive result. I think it's fine to say, I'm sorry that this feels really difficult, and I'm sorry that you're clearly having a really unpleasant time, or I'm sorry that this feels shocking, but to say, I'm sorry that the result is positive. I think for all of those ideas around HIV that we have that are negative, that we have carried around since, the messages that we were getting in the 80s and 90s, it all comes crashing down on you in that moment where you say, I'm sorry it's positive. You just confirm all of those things that people have carried around with them for years.
It kind of feels like you're basically apologizing to someone for having AIDS. How would you deliver the news to me? I mean, you've got the results in front of you, or we've done the finger prick test.
Being clear as possible.
Yeah, tell me.
So we've got the second test result. That's enough for us to confirm a diagnosis of HIV today.
This is where I cry. I'm imagining a lot of people don't cry just then because they're in shock. Like, I wouldn't cry for a long time, and then it just went raw.
It's a whole spectrum.
Yeah.
But I think it's that moment where you say, oh, I might cry. I find it really useful and really important to not just fill the silence with my own noise. Like, that person has just heard something that's really shocking that they didn't want to hear. And for me to just go, so what we do now, we do a series of blood tests and let's crash on. Everything's going to be absolutely fine. Like, it doesn't feel fine in that moment, and having space to not feel fine is important.
And I feel like it would be even more isolating for someone to see that the person who's delivering the news is not be able to connect and give you that space to mourn, which is so important. I discovered kind of way into my life as an HIV positive person. Yeah.
It's difficult to get right because sometimes you're delivering this life-changing news to a person that you've known for 5 minutes. So in terms of gauging where that's going to sit with somebody and how we move forward, it's tough from our side, but obviously the most important thing is just reacting to what's happening from blood crimes.
There are some stories that I've heard, which have happened here in London the last 2 years, of people who are shouted at, like in a hospital. This is all happening.
I wish I was surprised.
No, I'm not either.
The way that services in this country evolved, they came out of the need for specialist services because the rest of the NHS didn't want to and didn't know how to respond to HIV and AIDS at the time. So the development of specialist service has been wonderful in that there are centres of excellence where people can go and they can get exemplary care and exemplary treatment and be spoken to in a way about HIV that is realistic and humanising. But the expense of all of that is that we still have general services that don't know how to respond to
And that's the majority of all health services. So how long have you worked in sexual health? sexual well-being?
So I've been working in sexual health since 2012, and I've been a health advisor since 2015.
So that would be around the time where the preliminary data from the partner study started emerging, and I imagine that your work probably changed, the way you deliver news changed.
Oh, absolutely. In terms of being able to give something that is unquestionable, is certain, is zero, is just absolutely amazing for the way that people view their own risk. So
what was that? What was it like before?
I think it's hard, even if you're giving statistics of it's a 1 in a million chance or it's a 1 in 50,000 chance. The person that you're giving that news to is always thinking
About the one.
I'm the one.
Yeah.
It's going to be me. So to be able to say, well, actually, there's no risk, is something that you can't question. Really, it's amazing.
There's still quite a lot of resistance to that information from the general population. Why do you think that is? Because I find it really frustrating. Like, sometimes I lose a day to like conversations on social media about this because people just don't want to hear it.
Yeah.
Why do you think there's so much resistance?
I think a lot of it is kind of some of the things that we've discussed around the media and how the media responds to HIV. There's such a big gap in knowledge in the general public in terms of maybe the kind of early to mid 90s where HIV was still headline news and it was unavoidable and untreatable and all of these medications that were coming out weren't working and it was shameful and people were either clean or dirty and everything. All of that kind of stuff is the last time we had HIV really in the headlines. So to move from that understanding to actually, if you're on treatment and it's stable and it's effective, then there's zero risk of you passing it on. I just feel like in terms of the general public, rather than people living with HIV or people working in sexual health, we can kind of put together how we got there. But for the general public, there's this big gap in knowledge where it's like, it's awful, but now it's okay.
Once people are out of their formative years or where, when they study and so on, people don't really take on new information so much and they kind of rely on their biases. And the example isn't really being set by, like for example, across the health sector. I don't believe there is any guidelines that are effective in diagnosing HIV when it comes to mental health. Long term, like trying to reduce trauma and long-term mental health, and there should be, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so maybe there is, I feel like the gap. You can't really blame the population for something that is just not being offered, for not understanding something that's not being effectively, frequently offered to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
As a source of information.
I think it's really important to kind of compare what the medical community know about HIV and what people living with HIV know about HIV to people's ideas about HIV, because they're so completely different. So actually to have really solid information to give people has just absolutely changed the way that we conceptualize it as healthcare providers. I'm hoping that message is starting to filter through into communities in terms of HIV prevention. It's definitely in terms of people living with HIV. I know that UequalsU has been a huge thing for people to kind of lay to rest that final anxiety of that negligible risk. I'm hoping it's working in terms of prevention as well.
People get very uncomfortable just listening to someone talk about sexuality. Haven't I noticed? Earlier you said that you're the go-to in the clinic you work at when it comes to diagnosing trans people, right?
Yeah.
You yourself are a trans man? Mm-hmm. Do you identify as trans a man or?
I guess that's got less clear over the last few years, I think.
I always find that really fascinating. I think everyone does, but people don't necessarily feel comfortable to ask.
I guess when I was thinking about transition, so in the kind of the early stage of my 20s, I think it was really easy for me to reject anything feminine because it felt threatening to my idea of being a man and being perceived as a man. Right. Then after spending some time on testosterone and kind of being invited into that like boys club of masculinity, I was just like, oh, this is a bit more gross than I expected it to be. So in terms of, being party to conversations with mainly focused around like casual misogyny, because you're one of the lads and I get this joke about my girlfriend. Like, I think I got over to masculinity and was just like, I don't know if this is exactly me. And it's difficult to, I guess, kind of get away from people's perceptions of masculinity and what masculinity is for them. Do I know if I feel like all other people that identify as a man? Like, no, I've got no idea. So I guess I'm probably less far at that end of the spectrum than I thought I was, and kind of maybe moving towards a more non-binary space. But I guess also kind of still care.
I think a lot of people still care a lot about it because, I mean, identity is such a big part of everyone's life. Are there any particular trans-specific issues that people need to be aware of if they're HIV positive?
I guess dispelling some of the myths around HIV treatment for trans people is probably a useful place to start. If we go back sort of 10, 15 years, often it would be the case that trans women in particular, because we don't see any reactions with ART and testosterone therapy, would often be choosing between medication that worked for their HIV or hormone therapy that helped align their gender to something.
So this didn't affect trans men, but more trans women.
Yeah, so it was an interaction between certain classes of HIV medication and estrogen therapy, which meant obviously people would pick what felt the most important to them, and for a lot of trans people it's the hormone therapy that is more important than the HIV medication.
And that is no longer the case?
No, so we've got so many different classes of drugs that are effective and that are helpful for people that actually there's only a couple that wouldn't be prescribed in the first instance, but generally it's not something that we're concerned about.
What kind of medication? Do you have any names that do seem to be a little bit trickier than others?
So the ones that we would avoid would be any with boosted protease inhibitor. So as long as people are having sort of upfront conversations with their clinicians about any hormone therapy that they're taking, also taking into account that it might be something that isn't prescribed. Getting hormones in this country from the NHS is quite a sort of a slow, arduous process for people, so often we find people buying medication online, having it sent from friends in the States or in Thailand, etc, etc. And even if it's not medication that you are prescribed and being medically monitored for, it's really important for people to have a kind of upfront conversation with their doctors about what they're taking.
Of course, yes. I really want to ask you a little bit more about, if you don't mind, about what it feels like to be living as a trans man. What's your experience?
I mean, I think my experience is pretty privileged, if I'm perfectly honest. I've lost some friends over the years in the early stages of my transition who weren't supportive, but in the process of finding friends that were supportive, that's also been a life-changing moment in terms of that kind of whole, like, you really find out who your friends are type thing.
Probably best of losing the ones who weren't supportive.
Yeah, I think actually it's probably, looking back, not the worst thing that could have happened, but in terms of what I've been able to do since my transition, I went from thinking that trans men didn't exist, so if we're thinking kind of in the late 90s and early 2000s, in terms of representation, the view of trans people, particularly in the media, was still like bloke in a dress kind of parody of trans women. And there's me kind of in the early days of the internet, kind of scrapping around for information, trying to find somebody that looked like I thought I might look like when I was older. And it took me a really long time to find that. And when you don't see yourself in the world, it's hard to imagine how you're going to move forward, and if you're going to, you know, all those questions about like what do you want to do when you grow up, and all like what kind of career path. If you don't see yourself, it's impossible to answer those other questions. But actually, since transitioning, I've been really privileged to have supportive friends, supportive family, been to university. I'm not struggling in terms of the interactions of other sort of intersections of identity in terms of kind of culture, race, things like that. Like, it's a pretty privileged position to be in, I think.
I'm glad to hear that. How long has it been?
Crikey. It's amazing to think that I've actually lost count. I think, yeah, when people are kind of in the...
I don't know how old I am anymore.
So, Yeah, about a decade. Okay. So in the early stages of transition, it's really common to see guys like on like the YouTube channels and things just been like, oh my god, I've been 5 weeks on testosterone, and like counting every second of the transition. And it's just at the early stages, you don't think you'll ever get to that point when you're not having marker points of just going, oh my god. Like,
having what?
Kind of marker points of your transition, so kind of monitoring, oh well, I've been a year on testosterone and I've seen these changes. And...
Oh, I see, gotcha. Yeah. Makes sense. Like on the wall when you grow.
Yeah.
So clever, Aedan. London is quite it's a good place to be living with HIV. Is it a good place to be a trans person in London? Is there enough support?
I think from the health service perspective, there's still more that can be done. I think from a community perspective, it's probably one of the best places in the country to be. So rather than just having like one local support group where everyone sits around on plastic chairs and feels miserable, in like a church hall or something, there's options for young trans people through a service called Gendered Intelligence, where they have this amazing program of kind of arts and well-being. They have a summer camp for young trans people. There's a swimming group that is specifically for trans non-binary people. There's so many different things to choose from in London that even though society is not always the nicest and the most welcoming to our community, what the community has achieved in London has been fantastic.
Is this an organisation?
This is a separate organisation, so lots of different organisations.
Oh, so there's a website.
Yeah, so there's Gendered Intelligence, which is for young people.
Right.
The swimming organisation that I mentioned is called TAGS. There are specific organisations and workers that, in terms of sort of Galop, which is hate crime related and sexual assault and things like that, they have specific trans advocacy workers. We have people working specifically with the trans community at Stonewall housing. So in terms of kind of advocating for people and with people in terms of homelessness and things like that. So there's some really incredible projects in London.
If any of this interests you, the links to these websites are in the description below. What about any clinics? How is that in the UK for trans people?
So it's getting better. There are 2 specific services for trans people in London, which are literally only for trans people, non-binary people, or partners of, which is amazing. In terms of the rest of the sector's response to trans people, I think it's been a bit of a slow start, but actually compared to other areas of the NHS, sexual health feels like a really fertile ground for trans affirmative work, and it's quite exciting.
This is amazing to hear, seriously. And the links to that also are in the description below, so you can check them out. It's time for my favorite part. Hi, Karen. For those of you who are joining us, Karen has become quite a big thing during this series, and this is where it started.
Like, I don't want a straight, white, heterosexual woman who's sitting in an office in a public health building somewhere saying, why can't gay men just wear condoms? Bye, Karen.
Initially, it sounded like Karen was indeed just a straight, white, cisgender woman. Karen is actually just a format of healthcare, which continuously struggles, for understandable reasons, to cater to minorities like LGBTQ+, including trans people, people of color, drug users, sex workers, you name it. Many of my guests in this series have asked Karen a question, and I wonder if Aedan, you have a request for Karen.
Yeah, well, firstly I'd like to apologise to my 2 amazing colleagues called Karen. I don't mean you. I would like to ask when gynecology services are going to stop A, being only aimed at women, and B, painted pink.
I mean, I get why, but stop.
I think it's difficult in terms of transmasculine people accessing reproductive healthcare, so not specific to HIV.
Of course! Oh my god, duh! Most trans men have a vagina.
For me, walking into that space, knowing everyone is thinking, like, what's that guy there for? Like, It's unpleasant for transmasculine people, it's unpleasant for the other patients who are expecting a gendered space, especially if you're a service operating in like a large hospital where most of the waiting rooms aren't gendered until it comes to reproductive healthcare, and then they'll have a gendered space, and you just think that's alienating to so many of the people that could have used those services.
Wow. Do you have another one?
I would like to ask Karen when it's going to be possible for trans people to register at a sexual health clinic in England and pick an option that actually reflects who they are, rather than male, female, or other.
Is that still not happening? Bye, Karen. Are you on social media?
Yes, I'm on Twitter and it is at Aedan_James.
Fantastic. You can find the links to Aedan's social media in the description below. That's it for episode 8 of the diaries behind how to stay positive when you test positive. I do encourage you to catch up on the previous episodes. I can't wait to share how to stay positive when you test positive, the film, with you in a couple of months. If you like this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and hit that bell for notifications.
Bye, Karen.
I was so Karen. Okay. Bye, Karen, bitch. What's going on?